So what is the point? The point of reincarnation is the hope and the promise that it gives to our souls. 06, 07, we opened in December 07. The cupola wasn't even there. We had our 8-hour meditation that day, first use of the temple, and it was storming and blowing, and nobody would sit under there because they didn't know if the plastic covering would come down and they'd get soaked. But it reminds me, when he just read about memory, suddenly there came into my memory a dear friend of Padma and I. She's passed away not long after that, and she was kind of from New Jersey, you know, kind of a little bit tough, and she would say, "My memory's really good, it's just short." Well, I kind of relate to that about now, in this point in my life. Going into the other room, not remembering why, that sort of thing, although you don't need to be of any age to have that problem, of course. Reincarnation, you know, there's no proof for reincarnation. Often, and even recently, I talked about a favorite, not a favorite, but a book that I appreciated called The Soul Survivor. It was made into a movie. The movie is lousy, the book's lousy, but the story's great. The only reason it's great isn't from India or anywhere else in the East. It's from America with a couple who were, you know, born again type normal Christians or whatever. And they had a son who had nightmares of being a fighter pilot, etc., etc. I won't go into the story. My point is I went to refresh my memory about the story yesterday, and sure enough, I typed it in there. Up came a website called Joe Skeptic or something. Some guy trashed the story totally, okay? Now, I happened, because I read the book and I watched the movie, I could tell that his objections to the authenticity of the reincarnation of this little boy was not very intelligently grounded. But the point is you can't, you know, even the great scriptures of India admit that God can't be proved, not to the skeptic, not to the sense-bound, rational mind. And so, you know, there's kind of a dividing line. I've felt this for much of my life. We see it again and again and again. Palestine, the Middle East. It's like tectonic plates, an earthquake. East and West meet there, and the conflict never seems to end. And at that meeting point of East and West, we find reincarnation. You know, in Jesus' time, so far as my research has shown, there wasn't even a Hebrew word for reincarnation at that point. It was sort of vaguely mentioned here and there, but because Jewish tradition isn't so much dogma-oriented, but more behavior-oriented, the rules and so on, it isn't a big thing. Even in Jesus' time, there was one sect of people who didn't even believe in an afterlife, and another sect, actually the Pharisees, who did. Same thing there were intimations of reincarnation in Greek philosophy, for example, which had a lot of contact, by the way, with India in the centuries before Christ, when Alexander, who wasn't all that great, but when he went east, shall we say. Anyway, so it's not something you can prove. There's a wonderful recording. We used to call them CDs, but anyway, whatever they are nowadays, there's a beautiful recording. I say beautiful, it's inspiring and kind of fun, that of Yogananda's voice. He gives a talk, and he asks the question, well, one life or reincarnation? And so he gives the arguments, one life, reincarnation, and it's kind of charming. And so, you can approach the whole subject through logic. And there's something to be said for one life, isn't there? Because how's your memory? What do you remember of your past life? Oh, I've had a few intimations here and there, but it's mostly like astrology, just kind of fun, but don't take it too seriously kind of thing. And so we don't remember anything. So why should we worry about it? We don't know. We don't even know why we were born. We don't know where we came from. When we die, we don't know. We can't say we know where. We have opinions, but we don't know. There's a lot to be said for one life. It's kind of like the path that I've always admired. Kind of chop wood, carry water, or is it the other way around? Anyway, whatever it is, it's the path of Stoicism. Be here now. This is all you've got. There's a lot to be said for it. Unfortunately, it doesn't really satisfy the heart, at least as far as I'm concerned. It's like, be here now. This is all, like Frank Sinatra's song, is this all there is? Then let's go dancing. Okay, so you don't remember the song. I do. And so it is that there's much to be said for living here in the present moment, for not going into past life regressions and all this woo-woo stuff that people get into, okay? Much to be said for it. In fact, when you think about it, I know the Christians get a lot of criticism for the fact that they believe in heaven and hell. But my answer to that is, you don't have to go far to see heaven or hell, and you don't even need to die. It's all around us. But besides that, if your starting point is, and it's a valid starting point, that I only have one life, this is all I know, then if you also happen to believe there is an afterlife and no more lives or evolution or opportunities, then you're stuck. You're stuck with heaven or hell, because how can you not believe that there aren't consequences for what you do? If you didn't believe there was, you wouldn't brush your teeth. We are convinced by our actual experience that there are consequences. I won't go into it, but it's one of the learning things that a young person, a teenager, a young adult has to come to grips with eventually. We couldn't live, we wouldn't have an incentive to live if we didn't know, or at least believe, that there were consequences for what we did. You wouldn't even be in this room if you didn't. And so you see, that's how they got there. It's perfectly logical. Now, it's pretty intense to either go or heaven or hell, right? So they came up with something else. They said, that's a little intense. So why don't we create purgatory? Good solution. I think they did the right thing. I won't go into more than that. Let's just say that speaking as I am, logically, it makes a lot of sense. And then somebody said, well, what about those poor little babies? They didn't get baptized and they died. And well, let's see, where can they go? So they came up with something else. Fine. I don't really criticize it. It just makes sense. Okay? You're kind of stuck with it. Okay. So in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali says there's 3 basic ways by which we acquire knowledge. Okay? First way is by direct perception. I can see that it's not raining here. Okay, direct perception. Now, direct perception also includes the more metaphysical aspect of intuition. Intuitive perception is valid knowledge as well. It's just that it, like reincarnation or like the existence of God, it only goes as far as you are concerned until it gets proven in some other way. The other way, he says, is by inference. And there are, when we read the countless stories of reincarnation, we discover by inference that the different, the child remembered this and all the different facts that are offered for the case in reincarnation, it's inference. It's not proof. It's an inference that this child must have been that person before. And then, of course, there's valid authority. Traditionally considered scripture, of course, in East and West, and religion generally, your authority is your scriptural teachings. But there's many kinds of valid authority. An expert in computers would be a valid authority, and so on and so forth. And so for us, for disciples of a guru, our valid authority would be the teachings of the master. Okay? So Yogananda in this recording goes on and he begins to, again, using logic, we look around and we see the incredible diversity of circumstances in the world. We see great injustices in the world. We see people born with birth defects, disadvantages, disabilities, subjected to abuse. And then we can see it particularly nowadays with the kinds of education and awareness that we have. We can see that a disadvantaged birth will lead to an unhappy life, to even a life of crime. And so we look around and we, in this day and age, certainly, more so than I think before, because why? We can see this whole world. We can see all the different countries and the different cultures, and we know so much more about the patterns of life. And then we say, hey, as in fact we do, we rebel against injustice. And so we look around and then we happen upon this idea of reincarnation. And it begins to make a lot of sense. Some of the great thinkers of the West and more modern centuries endorse this idea of reincarnation. But we can't prove it. We can't prove that there's God. And yet, for those of us who look to the wisdom teachings, we can see that we are offered reincarnation as a teaching. And there's a chapter by our founder, Swami Kriyananda, in his life story, The New Path, there's a chapter called Reincarnation, and he traces the history of reincarnation and its teachings in the West in a very interesting way, showing how different Jewish teachers and so forth have talked about reincarnation, because as I said earlier, it is woven in the Jewish tradition. It's just not clarified. When you think of the age at the time of Christ, it was a barbaric age. I mean, people enjoyed seeing people covered in oil and burned to death. I mean, what fun. All we have is football, but which Padma loves, and I don't care much for unless it's the flush bowl. What is it? The Super Bowl. I'll watch that for fun, just to keep her company. But it was a barbaric age. And people's awareness, just in general, including of, lots of things, their bodies and the world around them, was pretty dark. I'm not saying it's great nowadays, okay? But it's not as bad. And if Jesus had come and announced to his listeners the dogma of reincarnation, his ministry would have been a non-starter. Nobody was talking about that. It was hidden there in the bushes, as it were. Jesus said, "Whom do men say I am?" And his disciples, who weren't really all that bright, but they were great souls. They just weren't all that bright in certain respects. He was always chastising them for being a little bit dense. One time they thought he had a sandwich on him, and when he said, "I have meat ye not know of," they looked around. It's like, anyway, So he asked him, who do men say I am? Well, some say you're Jeremiah or one of the prophets, and one said John the Baptist. Well, the guy had just been killed. I mean, what were they thinking, right? And so he had opportunities to address it. Okay, in that particular instant, he sidestepped it. He sidestepped it yet again after coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration. In chapter 35 of the Autobiography of a Yogi, I really encourage you to reread it. It's really literally enlightening, because Yogananda takes passages from the Bible and shows it's right there. For those with eyes to see, reincarnation is right there. Jesus came down after being transfigured into his astral body along with the presence of Moses and Elias and the disciples. The Bible says right in its own print that they understood from the experience that he was the Messiah. And so coming down, they don't say, hey, congratulations, Jesus, you're the Messiah. No, that was just a given. They said instead, well, where's Elias? Because the last words of the Old Testament was a prediction of the return of Elias. Now, does that have anything to do with reincarnation? Go figure. And so the three disciples with him, they knew that Elias was supposed to come first. Well, what did Jesus say again? He sidestepped it. He said, Elias has come already, but they knew him not and did with him what they wanted, meaning, and then it says in parentheses, I don't know if the guy who wrote the King James Bible knew about parentheses, but it's in parentheses now, and it says, and then the disciples understood that he spake, or whatever, them of John the Baptist. Is that reincarnation? Sure seems like it. And then in Swami's autobiography, The New Path, he traces, as other actual scholars have, that in 553 AD at the Council of Constantinople, the teaching of reincarnation was in fact taken out. One of the early teachers in Christianity, a man named, I don't know how to say it, Origen or something, was a well-respected so-called father of the church. And he said that reincarnation had been taught since apostolic times, since Jesus' time and the time of the disciples. And yet later, for other reasons, he was considered, politically incorrect by the later church fathers. But nonetheless, the point being, it's not as if it isn't there. Okay? It's not as if the valid authority of teaching can't be found even in the teachings of Jesus Christ. But I say, so what? I can't prove it. I don't know anything about my past life. What's the point? So what is the point? The point of reincarnation is the hope and the promise that it gives to our souls. Because the alternative isn't very encouraging. The alternative, as I've already indicated, is eternal hell or heaven, the latter of which actually sounds a little boring to me. Reincarnation offers us, through the valid authority of the saints and masters of East and West, the hope and the promise that be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect, is our destiny. It's the promise of the Scriptures. And, when science gives us this incredible vision of 100 billion galaxies, thousands of light years. What's a light year? How far light travels in 1 second? Isn't that what it is? 1 second?
1 year. In 1 year.
1 year, I'm sorry, right. That's a lot at 365,000 miles a second. It's a long distance. So the vision offered us by science, something that we more readily accept in our culture, more readily, maybe not entirely, but more readily, coincides with this vision of countless, innumerable reincarnations, lifetimes, not to even mention in lower life forms. You don't even want to go there. Paramhansa Yogananda once said he remembered a lifetime as a diamond. Now, some people say diamonds are forever, but apparently not. Nothing in creation, of course, is forever. The point being is the concept of time and space is so incredible that it's almost not worth going there. Where does that leave us, though? It leaves us feeling pretty hopeless when we look at it that way. And yet, every atom, Yogananda said, is dowered with individuality. He said, I cognize in a state of cosmic consciousness the point of the center of the universe as a point of intuitive perception in my own heart. In other words, in relativity, there's time and space in these huge dimensions, but in the eternal present, there's eternity. This is our hope. It's not really about reincarnation. That's simply in the duality of time and space, the promise of the scriptures, but the transcendence of the other side of that promise, which is its burden, which is, when will I get there? It's hopeless. I look at myself in the mirror in the morning, I think, I'm never going to get there. It's right here and now. The one life people were right. It's only here and only now. The promise of the scriptures with reincarnation is simply for those who aren't quite here yet. It's all right here. And next week we're going to talk about karma, and the transcendence of karma follows the one life here and now.
Awake, for morning in the bowl of night has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight.